Hello? Hello, thank you all for coming. My name is Rosa Matskin. I'm going to introduce the current president of the Econometric Society, Guido Tabellini. Before I do that, I just want to thank the program organizers of this joint conference of the Latin American and Caribbean Economic Association and the Latin American region of the Econometric Society for having done such a wonderful job at hosting us in such a beautiful university and having prepared such a high-quality program. I'm sure we will all benefit from the vibrant and stimulating interactions that such excellent preparations can generate. So Guido Tabellini, of course, is someone that needs no introduction. He has been a transformative figure in academia. After graduating in 1985 from UCLA with a PhD in economics, he held faculty positions at Stanford University, UCLA, University di Calgary, and University di Brescia, before joining Bocconi University, where he has been a professor of economics since 1994, director and president of Innocenzo Gasparini Institute for Economic Research since 1994 to 2008, and rector of Bocconi University from 2008 to 2012. Since 2013, he holds the Intensa San Paolo Chair in Political Economics at Bocconi University. To mention some of his very long list of academic honors, he's the recipient of the Guido Chenson Award, which is given by the European Economic Association to the best economist under the age of 45. He's a foreign honorary member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences since 2003. He was president of the European Economic Association in 2007. He was elected a member of the European Academia in 2012 and was elected a foreign honorary member of the American Economic Association in 2016. For his influence did not stop in academia. He was an economic consultant to the World Bank, the IMF, and the Italian Treasury. He was also a member of the Italian Prime Minister Council of Economic Advisors, and in 2013 he was a member of the Commission for Constitutional Reform appointed by the Italian government. In his website, Guido Tabellini lists his research areas, macroeconomics and monetary policy, public economics, international economics, and political economics. However, to anyone familiar with his research approach, a list like this does not make justice to his work. He has answered fundamental questions by analyzing them using economic tools from these and other fields. And while it would take me years, rather than a few minutes I was given, to make justice to his work, I will mention the work that Guido Tabellini and Thorsten Persson have developed and presented in two very well-known books that transform the way in which many questions are analyzed and from then. So the first book is entitled Political Economics, Explaining Economic Policy. The second one is The Economic Effects of Constitutions. In the first book, the authors built the framework that provides a foundation on which many essential questions on political economics have been analyzed. The structure was built on three main building blocks. Following what the authors themselves express in their book, one of the building blocks was the theory of macroeconomic policy, dating back to Lucas in the work in the 70s, Kidler and Prescott, and Calvo. In these policies are formulated as rules and give context to private expectations. So this allows to study how rational individuals reason strategically and base their expectations on their perceptions of the policymakers' incentives. The second building block was the public choice, which goes back to Buchanan and Tulloch and Olson in the 60s. This literature focused on public finance, trade policy, and regulatory policy, and the agency problem between the government and the citizens. This literature emphasized lobbying and the pervasiveness of rent-seeking activities, and also informational issues. So a third building block was political science, which goes back to Ricker in '62 and Arrow in Possibility Theorem, and it's often referred as rational choice. So the book presents a framework that integrates this and more to analyze the interplay between political institutions and the citizens. Okay? Also to analyze the differences in fiscal policies as generated from different democratic institutions and the interplay, the intertemporal issues of pension, capital taxation, and growth. The second book presents the results of empirical works that the authors undertook to either validate or invalidate the models of the first book, and then they outline the way forward based on such results. So these two books are only examples of the massive amount of research that Guido Tabellini has produced. I will stop here because it's better if you hear him than me. So Guido is going to talk on identity politics. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Rosa, for your very, very kind words. It's a great honor and privilege to be here and to talk in front of you. But before I talk about my research, there are a couple of things that I would like to do. The first is to thank the individuals who have organized this conference and on behalf of the Econometric Society and of LASEA. Of course, these conferences require a lot of work. They don't just happen automatically. So I would like to thank, first of all, our host, the Universidad del Pacífico, and in particular, its president, Filippo Portocarrero, the vice presidents, Arlette Beltran and Marta Chavez, and the Dean Faculty of Economics, Juan Castro. I would like to thank very warmly the conference chair, Pablo Lavado, who I'm sure did a lot of work to put all of this together, as well as the scientific committee, consisting of Anna Dammert, Alberto Chong, and Cesar Martinelli, and the local organizing committee, consisting of Rocio Pacheco, Milagros Otegui, and Luciana Casida. I hope I'm not mispronouncing your names. I also would like to take this opportunity to thank the Econometric Society Latin America Regional Standing Committee, who, as you know, organizes a lot of the activities of the Econometric Society in the region. In particular, its chair, Aureo de Paula, who would have liked to be here but missed his plane, and so is not among us, unfortunately, and the secretary, Jean Lafortune. And finally, I wish to thank the Latin American and Caribbean Economic Association and its officers for the continued and very successful cooperation with the Econometric Society over the years. So thank you. Second, I would like to take this opportunity to honor and welcome the fellows, the new fellows that have recently been awarded the fellowship of the Econometric Society, some of whom are attending this conference. As you know, the fellows represent the highest authority of the Econometric Society, and it's a great honor to be elected. Since its beginning in 1933, only about 1,100 fellows have been elected. So I would like to welcome to the stage, to give them the paper certificate, a number of fellows who are attending this conference who were elected between 2020 and 2022. So besides Aureo de Paula, who, as I said, could not be here, I would like to call Federico Echenique. Hi, congratulations, this is yours. Then, if you can wait, I think Lynn Hogan would like to take a picture of all the fellows together. And there are a few more. Marcela Eslava. Hi, congratulations. Ernesto Shagrodowski. I probably mispronounced your name.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Rodriguez Soares. There are two whom I told are attending but maybe have not arrived. I don't know whether they are here. Dean Carlan and Silvana Tenreiro. They are not here. I don't know whether I am forgetting someone, whether there are any fellows elected between 2020 and 2022 since COVID that are attending this conference. If not, let's congratulate once more the new fellows, and I think Lynn would like to take a picture. In the middle. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm then eager to talk about my research, which is joint work with my Bocconi colleague, Nicola Gennaioli. I don't know whether the slides are up. They are, okay. So, in relation to the very nice introduction that Rosa made, it's true that at the beginning political economics was built on the existing and then new work of rational expectations. But more recently, the literature and certainly my own research has abandoned the rational choice hypothesis that voters are rational in their decisions. Early on, there was a big debate between economists and non-economists on how appropriate it was to assume rationality on behalf of the voters, and I think it was the right starting point, but ultimately I also think that the political scientists were right. And so in this paper we pursue a more behavioral approach to focus on voter behavior. But besides the approach itself, we are motivated in this work by what is happening in several Western democracies, and in particular by two stylized facts. The first is the emergence of a new cleavage in several countries, both with regard to voters and with regard to parties or politicians. Both voters and parties are increasingly divided by, let me call them cultural issues, like immigration, civil rights, race relations, and much less so than, or at least not much so, by economic issues, despite the rise in inequality. There are many ways of showing this. In this picture, we look at US voters, at surveys of US voters, and we plot the variance of a number of opinions on cultural issues and on redistribution. And the dotted line, which reflects the variance, reports the variance of the cultural issues, as you see, has increased over time since the late 90s compared to, instead, the variance on economic issues. And if you look at party platforms, you see something similar in several, not all, but in several countries. The second motivating fact is a political realignment that has taken place in several countries, and Thomas Piketty and his co-authors have documented this extensively. Voters now sort among left versus right parties predominantly or a lot based on their culture and education, and less so than in the past based on income. In particular, in the past, the left-wing voters used to overrepresent the poor, now they instead they still do to some extent, but this has changed in the sense that now they overrepresent the highly educated voters, and the right is moved in the opposite direction. And of course, this realignment is related to the rise of populist parties in some parts of Europe and in other countries. And here is a picture that illustrates this fact with regard to the US again, and it plots over time the composition of voters who identify themselves as Democrat and voters who identify themselves as Republican. Of course, some do not identify in any way. And in different demographic groups. So the blue line is the percentage of voters in the top 10% of the income distribution minus the percentage of the voters in the remainder of the income distribution who identify themselves as Democrat. And as you see, now it used to be that lower income voters were overrepresented by the Democratic Party. Now it's about even, and the opposite has happened on the Republican Party. The other lines reflect education. Highly educated voters, as you see, are now more likely to be Democrat. Urban voters are more likely have turned to the Democratic Party, and then secular voters have moved to the Democratic Party. Of course, both of these changes have been discussed extensively in the literature, and I think it's fair to say that there is not a clear consensus of whether the origin is on the demand side of politics or on the supply side of politics. But either way, I think there are puzzles that are raised. If these changes originate in voters' behavior, it is not clear why preferences of voters have changed, and in particular, it is not clear why some of these low-class conservative voters have shifted towards voting for the right. This is also surprising because, for instance, the rise of populist parties in Europe, many of them are right-wing populist parties, not all of them, but the evidence speaks very clearly that this phenomenon is stronger among economically insecure voters and among economically insecure areas. So it's not obvious why voters have moved their behavior in this way. Some authors have argued that the origin of these changes lies on the supply side, with some party insiders have becoming more extremist on some of these cultural issues, both on the left and on the right. But this too begs the question of why do we see this phenomenon happening in so many countries at roughly the same times. And also, if you look at independent voters, not voters who are identified with a party, similar changes in the nature of their polarization has taken place there as well. So this suggests that it's not only better sorting of parties induced by supply changes, supply-side changes on party behavior that is driving some of these phenomena. So what we do in this paper is to seek to explain these facts as originating mostly from changes in voters' behavior, so taking a demand-side approach, and then explore the implications that this may have on the supply side. In particular, we argue that looking at voters' social identities is one way to understand the changes in these social cleavages. In the past, economic groups were the main carriers of social identities, and that carried a conflict, carried an emphasis on conflict over redistribution and class struggle. Now, more recently, social groups like race, nationality, local community are the carriers of social identity, and this brings an emphasis on cultural conflict and issues that are predominantly relevant for these different social groups. We then embed this approach of changing preferences due to changing social identities in an old framework in political science, pioneered many years ago by Lipset and Rockham, who argued that political parties represent social groups in society. And then we study when the social cleavages change, how does the party system adapt to these new social cleavages, and in particular, how do parties change their policy platforms and voters realign across parties. And finally, we allow, through propaganda, for these changes on the supply side to feed back into what happens to voters and the demand side. To give concreteness to the idea that the social identity is important and is related to these phenomena, we have run a survey of a US representative sample of respondents very recently, and we obtained two sets of results from the survey. The first, to our surprise, cultural identity, so identifying with a cultural group rather than an economic group, is a very prevalent form of social identification. So in the survey, we ask respondents to choose which group in a closed list best represent their social identity. And as you see, 2/3 of respondents selected a cultural group, like I'm best represented by a group defined by my religion, by my race, by my local community. The remaining third splits evenly between those who identify with an economic group, like a working class, or a political group, one of the two predominant parties. So cultural identity and cultural groups are important carriers of social identity. That's the first result. The second result, and that was what was looking for, we were not surprised, but nevertheless it's a confirmation, these social identities are strongly correlated with voters' preferences and voters' opinions. So we divided these cultural groups into conservative, like being religious or being identified with my local community, versus progressive groups, like being secular or being a citizen of the world. And then we divided economic groups between working class and upper middle class. And we asked a number of policy questions and opinions. Here we illustrate principal components of a set of questions on cultural issues and economic issues. And as you see, the opposite cultural groups, individuals who identify with opposite cultural groups, have sharply distinct policy views, both on cultural and on economic issues. Those who identify with opposite economic groups disagree on economic policy. So these are only correlation. It tells you nothing about causation, of course, but it is suggestive that social identity is something that we need to think about if we try to explain sources of cleavages and polarization in society. Now, we are not the first, of course, to talk about social identity, and the pioneering work on social identity was done by social psychologists in the 70s and 80s, people like Turner and Tajifel, and you find the following ideas in their work. The first, social identity is a form of self-categorization. So I see myself as a member of a group of similar individuals, and when we discuss politics, this group is in contrast to some outgroup of individuals who differ in significant respects. And then they emphasize how this process of categorizations typically is associated with distortions in our perceptions. in any context, not just in a social context. So when we categorize object of people, we tend to accentuate similarities within the same category and exaggerate differences between categories. If I think about the differences between Italians and Peruvian, I tend to think that they are very different, but I forget that there are huge differences within each of these categories. And the second distortion that is typically associated with social identification is what they call depersonalization. So when I socially identify with a group, and this identification is relevant and salient, I perceive myself as an exemplar member of the group, and I slant my beliefs towards those that are distinctive of the group I identify with. Distinctive here really means stereotypical, not just average, but stereotypical of the group. And so the conclusion is that social identities shape beliefs and can amplify group conflict. The second idea that you find in the literature discusses the question of what determines how we identify. Of course, we all have several identities. I am Italian, I am male, I'm an economist, and so on. And so which of these several identities is relevant in a social or political situation, they argue, depends on a trade-off between similarity. Of course, I identify more easily with the group I am more similar to, and contrast between the in-group and the out-group. So as the contrast increases, this makes it more likely that I identify in that dimension. So now I am identifying myself as an economist and a political economist. If I were to watch a soccer game between Italy and Argentina, there is no doubt that my Italian identity would prevail. So the idea is that when the economic or social environment changes in some significant way, we change our social identity, and this process then changes the dimensions over which society is polarized. Very briefly, some mention of related work in economics. The idea of identity was brought to the attention of economists by Akerlof and Cranton several years ago. But they discussed more the implications of identity. They viewed it as exogenous. Then Moses Shayo, in his PhD dissertation, made a very important step forward and talked about endogenous identity, emphasizing more the trade-off between similarity and social status rather than contrast. So I identify more easily with higher status group. And he emphasized how identity carries a bias towards the in-group, so it changes your preferences directly. In more recent work, related of course to what I'm talking about today, with Giampaolo Bonomi, we emphasize the group contrast as a determinant of identity and how identity changes your beliefs. And in this sense, what we talk about is also strongly related to a recent empirical literature about how beliefs of voters are highly distorted in many systematic ways. So what I want to do in the remainder of the time that we have is to review briefly the insights of the work that we recently did with Bonomi and Gennaioli that talks about the demand side of politics and illustrate how social identity can amplify and propagate the effects of shocks and changes. And then devote more attention to the supply side, discussing how political parties adapt to these changes in the social cleavages and how these supply side behavior then feedback into voters' behavior. And finally, I want to devote the last part to illustrate how specific economic shocks can lead to identity changes and discuss some empirical evidence on the consequences of trade shocks, which is in line with some of the predictions of the model. So let me then start with reviewing this approach. And so because we want to talk about two dimensions of political conflict, we consider a world in which there are two policy tools, and a proportional income tax, tau, and a cultural policy, Q. Think of the cultural policy as immigration or civil rights. Because we want to model beliefs, we allow individuals to be uncertain about some features of the environment. So individuals are uncertain about their future relative income. This uncertainty could generate from uncertainty about their own individual position or aggregate uncertainty about the economy. And so a voter type I has relative income, epsilon I, which is distributed as a random variable with mean epsilon I. So epsilon I is the expected relative income of a voter of type I. Individuals have preferences about the cultural policies, but they are also uncertain about these preferences. Psi tilde j is the bliss point for this cultural policy of an individual of cultural type j, which is randomly distributed with a mean of psi j. So psi j denotes the economic type of this individual, and higher psi refers to a more liberal policy, more progressive policies. Individual preferences in expected terms, so the expected welfare, rationally expected welfare of an economic type I and cultural type J over these two policies is given by this expression. So the first term is consumption net of taxes, so average income is 1 and relative income is epsilon I. Taxes are collected to finance a public good, G. There are tax distortions, for simplicity modeled as a quadratic function, and V is a marginal utility of the public good, which here is a parameter, could also be affected by some of these beliefs. So this is the economic part of welfare. The cultural part of welfare is the deviation. It's a loss function. So you bear a loss in proportion to how distant the policy is from your cultural bliss point, and kappa is the relative wealth significance, the relative importance in your welfare function of the cultural policy. So here, there are then two dimensions, and for simplicity, two dimensions of disagreement, one related to income, one related to your cultural preferences. And for simplicity, we assume that there are 4 possible types of voters. And to preserve symmetry, each type consists of a group of equal size, 1/4 of the population. So voters can be rich or poor. They can belong to the upper class. They can belong to the upper class or to the lower class. If they belong to the upper class, their relative income is plus epsilon. If they belong to the lower class, their relative income is minus epsilon. And then they can be progressives or conservative, and again, it's symmetric. If they're progressive, their bliss point is psi. If they are conservative, their bliss point is minus psi. So here you see represented the population in this economy. On the horizontal axis, you have income. On the vertical axis, you have cultural progressiveness. This is a lower class conservative. This is a lower class progressive, and so on. Okay? And you can generalize this to have a continuum of voters. Now, individuals can identify either with their class, in which case they see the world as divided between upper and lower classes, between reds and blues, or they can identify with their cultural group, in which case they see the world as divided between conservative and progressives. And how they see the world, how they identify, matters for their beliefs. So we here don't have time to go through the formalization, but we assume, following recent work by Bordello, Schleifer, Gennaioli, and Kaufman, that beliefs are slanted towards the stereotype of the group. Sorry, the beliefs are distorted towards the stereotyped beliefs of the group you identify with. So you, following the work of these authors, stereotypes are modeled as overweighting of realizations of these random variables that are distinctive of the group you identify with. And belief emerges as a fixed point. So if you identify with the lower class group, and then you see the world as divided between rich and poor, the poor exaggerate their poverty, and the rich exaggerate their richness because these are the distinctive beliefs of the groups they identify with. If instead you have a cultural identity and you identify with your conservative group, then the social identification makes you more extreme, more polarized on the cultural dimension. And then when identity changes dimension, preferences change, and so one set of beliefs becomes more polarized, the other set of belief becomes less polarized. The second step that we take is to model an endogenous identity, so we model this trade-off between similarity and contrast, and the contrast is defined based on rational welfare. It could be defined based on stereotypical welfare. Implications would not be very different. So what do I mean by that? So the contrast between in-group G and out-group G bar is the welfare of the average in-group evaluated at its bliss point minus the welfare of the average in-group evaluated at the bliss point of the average out-group member. Okay, so that's a natural definition of group contrast. And then we define group similarity in the same way, and you identify on the dimension that optimizes this trade-off. And in this very simple model, everyone identifies with their cultural group if this inequality holds. What this tells you is that the intensity of cultural conflict is greater than the intensity of the economic conflict. Epsilon, remember, is a measure of income inequality. It's the income difference between the upper and the lower classes. Psi is a measure of economic disagreement. Kappa is the welfare relevance of the cultural policy in the welfare of the individual, and V is the weight on the public good. So if cultural conflict is larger than economic conflict, then you identify on the cultural dimension. So the implication of this approach are, I think, obvious at this point. Suppose that you initially identify based on your class, and now the welfare relevance of cultural conflict rises, maybe because there is an inflow of immigrants and we care more about immigrants. Then you abandon your class identity, you switch to cultural identity, your belief distortions switch, conflict over redistribution is dampened because you no longer see the world as defined by a class struggle between rich and poor, and instead you now exacerbate cultural conflict. And we argue in the paper that was recently published that this is consistent with observed survey data in several ways. In particular, it is consistent with this picture that illustrates the which problems, this is taken from a recent Pew survey, which illustrates which problems are perceived as one of the three most important problems by respondents. As you see, at the beginning of 2000, individuals begin to give more weight to race and immigration. Then there is the financial crisis, which attenuates this, but then after the end of the financial crisis, again, this becomes more important. And in the paper, we discuss other implications on correlation between opinions that are consistent with these particular changes in voters' preferences. Let me now, rather than go more into these details, discuss what are the implications of these identity shifts when you pay attention to the supply side. So here, we take a standard approach in electoral competition. We assume that there are two parties. These two parties are opportunistic. They want to maximize their vote shares, and they commit to policy platforms over these two policy tools before the elections. And voters trade off, as in a probabilistic voting model, the intensity of their policy preferences against some shock about the popularity of these two parties or these two candidates. And delta K here is the popularity shock the popularity shock of candidate D for a particular voter K, which is assumed to be uniformly distributed in the population. Now, if this was a standard probabilistic voting model, both parties would converge to some point which is defined by the distribution of these shocks. We want parties to diverge while retaining the assumption that they are opportunistic. We want to stay away from parties and politicians who are motivated by a policy view. And so a simple way to generate policy divergence is just to assume that because of the history of these two parties, the Republican Party is more trusted by some groups in society, and the Democratic Party is more trusted by other groups in society. By more trusted, we mean literally that some groups do not fully believe the policy announcements made by these two parties, or maybe they don't pay attention and don't hear what this party says. In particular, we assume that some lower class progressive voters do not hear or do not believe the announcements of the Republican Party. Some upper-class conservative voters do not believe or hear the policy announcements of the Democratic Party. The other voters fully do. And this is related, I think, to the Lipset-Rocking assumption that different parties traditionally are connected with different social groups, and the groups they are not connected to pay less attention to the policy announcements of these parties. Now, in this world, it's easy to see that in equilibrium there will be policy divergence. So the Republican Party enacts a more conservative cultural policy because it does not fully internalize the preferences of the progressive lower class. And for the same reason, it chooses a less redistributive tax policy. Now, the interesting point, however, is that if voters change their identity from class to culture, these optimizing parties change their policy platforms, and in particular, party platforms become more divergent in the dimension over which society is more polarized, the cultural dimension, and they become less divergent in the economic dimension over which voters' preferences have become more similar. So changes in voters' preferences are fully reflected in the equilibrium policy platforms. Then we ask, how does this is reflected in the realignment of vote shares among these two competing parties? Let me denote by pi ijp the vote share of party P in, among economic type IJ. And you can show that under class identity, voters sort across parties by their income. Under cultural identity, voters instead sort across parties by their culture. So in particular, if identity shifts from class to culture, the Republican Party gains votes among the conservative voters, it loses votes among the progressives, and to a lesser extent also among the lower class voters. This last prediction that now lower class voters start to turn to the right and vote Republican is actually the specific prediction of this model with identity. So if you let the relevance of culture increase, even in a model with rational voters, the conservative voters would now turn to the Republican Party because they care more about the cultural issues. But that model with rational voters would not have the implication that lower class voters now also shift to the right. Here they do so because these lower class voters care less about redistribution, and party platforms have converged over redistribution. So this is consistent clearly with the evidence on voters' realignments that I discussed at the beginning. Notice that here this realignment is totally induced by what happens on the demand side, although the supply side is moving. And some papers in the literature have argued, look, the realignment that we see is caused by the supply side changes, by the fact that the Democrats have become very progressive and they have abandoned the working class on economic issues. And because of this change in the Democratic Party in the US, voters have realigned across parties in this way. So they attribute the realignment to the insiders in the Democratic Party, for instance, having gained influence. But this is a non sequitur because the party changes here are endogenous to what happens on the demand side. So here it is an example of changes in the demand side that induce changes on the supply, and equilibrium then results in realignment, but the shock here is entirely on the demand side, not on the supply side. The last step that we do here is to allow, however, for feedback from the supply back to voters' behavior on their preferences. So we argue that through propaganda, political parties can influence the strength of stereotypical thinking. And in particular, we make three assumptions that to us seem natural. The first is that through its statements and propaganda, a politician can either increase or dampen stereotypical thinking. So when you hear Trump saying that immigrants are criminal, conservative voters enhance their stereotypical thinking that they dislike immigrants. So that's the first assumption. If Trump instead had said that immigrants are hardworking, nice people, that would dampen the stereotype of conservative voters. So Trump could choose either to strengthen or to dampen these stereotypes. The second assumption that we make is that when Trump makes these statements, he is heard by everybody. So he cannot target his propaganda just to the Republican. When Trump says that immigrants are criminal, progressive voters hear these outrageous statements and he exaggerates his stereotypical thinking in the opposite direction. He likes immigrants even more because disliking immigrant is typical of the outgroup. And so enhancing stereotypes enhances stereotypes of in-group and out-groups. However, and that's the third assumption that we make, in line with some evidence, this propaganda is more persuasive and more effective on the core voters of a political party. So conservatives and the upper class are more influenced by the Republican propaganda than the opposite groups. And then we ask what happens in this world in which parties simultaneously choose policy platforms and costly effort to persuade voters, taking voters' identity as given. So here we don't study, this is something that could be done, but we don't do it. We don't study how politicians can actually change voters' identity. And we get the following result. Let me go through the intuition quickly. So in this world, parties have taken different policy positions. And so the Republican Party, who is on the right, would like to shift the distribution of voters' preferences to the right. So he would like to inflate the extremism of right-wing voters and moderate the extremism of the left-wing voters. If he could do that, he would shift the distribution of voters where he's sitting. He cannot do that. He has to either exacerbate or dampen voters' extremism on both directions, but by assumption, his words are more effective on his own supporters than on the others. And so in equilibrium, both parties find it optimal to engage in extremism inflating propaganda. Okay, so that's an optimal response. Moreover, there is a complementarity here. If voters are more polarized, then parties are more polarized. And if parties are more polarized, their incentives to shift voters' preferences is stronger. And so the more polarized are voters, the more politicians engaged in propaganda that further drives voters apart. Okay? Of course, for this to be an interior equilibrium, the cost of persuasion has to rise sufficiently rapidly at some point. And identity here matters because it determines the dimension over which this extremist propaganda is undertaken. And it's undertaken in the dimension over which voters identify. So when you switch from class to cultural identity, politicians stop making propaganda on class struggle and start to make propaganda on race and immigration. And therefore, they amplify even further this effect of social identification. The last step that I want to take you through quickly is to show you how these processes related to identity shifts can occur also as a result of specific economic shocks. So in particular, trade shocks. And before we go through the details, the intuition is that there are economic shocks that hit different social groups differently. And trade shock or technology are examples of such shocks. They hit less educated voters who are more conservative more than progressive voters that are more highly educated. So these economic shocks increase the conflict between different cultural groups, and in this way they can trigger an identity shift. So imagine that the same economy now is a small open economy. There are two sectors, an export and an import sector, and the taxable income that I described before is entirely in the export sector. But now voters also have a non-taxable endowment that is more likely to be employed in the export sector than in the import sector if you are progressive, and vice versa, it's more likely to be employed in the import sector if you are conservative. So here, education determines your exposure to import competition and also your cultural views. And there is an additional policy tool, which is a tariff, and the economy consists of several localities that differ in their trade exposure. Here, the result is that if the economy becomes more exposed to import competition, then the conservative voters, and only the conservative voters, not the progressive, switch to cultural identity in the more exposed localities, but not in the less exposed localities. The reason is that in the more exposed localities, these conservative voters demand more trade protection, but demanding trade protection is a distinctive trait of less educated conservative voters, and so it makes it more likely that you identify yourself as conservative. In other words, culture was a latent fault line in class identity, which is amplified by trade shocks and can be amplified by technology shocks as well. And so the simple version of the model then leads to the following three predictions. In the more exposed localities compared to the less exposed to import competition, on average, voters want a more conservative cultural policy because the conservative has switched identity, but not the progressives. And voters have also become less extreme with regard to redistribution. Second, both parties follow the voters' shift, and they set a lower Q, a more conservative cultural policy. But because the Republican Party is more connected to the conservative voters, the policy shift is stronger for the Republican Party. And so this leads to more policy divergence on Q. There are also implications on tau, which I don't have time to go through. And third, both parties engage in more conservative cultural propaganda, but in particular, the Republican Party does so. So you see that an economic shock here can have very far-reaching effects on voters' preferences over distant things like race relations and immigration, and similarly, it can have far-reaching effects on party positions. So the last part of the paper goes through some evidence following the pioneering work that was done by David Autor with his co-authors. So we look at changes in exposure to import competition from China, and we look at two sets of in different US commuter zones. We look at two outcomes. One set of outcomes is voters' opinions. David Autor and his co-authors had looked at voting behavior. Here we look directly at the beliefs and opinions on redistribution and on immigration. And we also exploit a panel dimension that is available in these survey data. So we do changes in voters' opinion and a diff in diff estimation on repeated cross-sections, following very much the standards in this literature, and you find that voters in the more exposed zones have become more conservative as predicted. They have also become more averse to redistribution. Actually, the lower class voters in particular are predicted to have become more averse to redistribution. And then we look at specific effects in subgroup of respondents. The theory predicts that it's the conservative voters who become more anti-immigrant, and in fact, it's the religious respondents, not the secular respondents, who change their views, and the lower class demand less redistribution. The upper class are predicted to be more in favor of redistribution in the more exposed areas. This is not actually what we find, but the effect of the lower class is there. And finally, and that's the last thing we do, we consider what happens on the supply side of politics. So here we exploit an indicator that was recently measured by Ben Enke, that measures the communitarian versus universalistic content of congressional speeches. Universalistic means more progressive. It's like the Q in our model. And then we regress the changes in universalistic relative to communitarian keywords to exposure to import competition in different US districts. And as predicted, we find that these more exposed districts, after adjusting for redistricting, elect congressmen that speak less universalistic, so have more communitarian and more conservative keywords in their congressional speeches. And the effect is driven by districts where the majority of respondents are white, where the share of white, non-Hispanic respondents is above the national median. So it's the white, non-Hispanic voters that tend to become more likely to elect these conservative politicians. And finally, we look at whether the changes in rhetoric is predominant of the Republican and the Democrat, and no matter how you measure this, it's the Republican Party that becomes more communitarian in its rhetoric, as the model would have predicted. So I see here that the clock tells me that I have 15 minutes left, but I think that's a mistake. I imagine that I have to stop now or soon, so let me wrap up. There are many distortions in political beliefs, and our approach can provide a framework for how to make sense of these distortions, and it can also provide a framework for explaining how the effects of changes in the society or the economy are amplified by social identities. And in particular, shocks that increase the relevance of cultural issues and that create conflict between more and less educated groups of voters can trigger the emergence of a new cleavage based on culture, can dampen redistributive conflict, and can explain the voters' realignment that you see in the data. And it provides also a framework to analyze persuasion. Many things remain to be done, but let me stop here. I don't know whether there is time for taking a few questions. I ask this to the organizers of the event, or whether we should stop here. I don't know who is responsible to answer this question. Yes, we take one question if there is. Yes. So I think the implications, so the question is if this has normative implications for improving policy making. I think the specific implications also depend on the details of the electoral system, first of all. So in a majoritarian electoral system, these phenomena occur within party. In a proportional electoral system, these realignments may lead to the emergence of new parties. So that's one dimension that we have not explored. I think, as always, one would like voters to be better informed, but I don't have a clear answer to this question. We are showing how these distortions change depending on the circumstances of the environment. We don't have a good understanding of how to mitigate these distortions, which are at the heart of this approach. Other papers by other scholars like Stephanie Sancheva and political scientists have asked whether providing voters with more and more accurate information is something that reduces these belief distortions, and the evidence is very mixed. The effect don't seem to be very long-lasting, so it's not obvious that there are immediate implications to remedy this. So I think we need to stop, and so I wish to thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you, Guido. Thank you. Thank you, Guido. A quick announcement. Now we have the contribution